But let's talk about what has been the main international news story of the day. That is the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88. Let's speak to John Hooper, who is the Italy and Vatican correspondent for The Economist. John, thank you so much for joining me. We're having to do a bit of a handbrake, turn and vault fast when it comes to talking from one subject to the next. But talk to me about now what is going on in the Vatican after the death of a pope. This is a huge, massive international event. There's a lot of ritual, there's a lot of protocol surrounding what happens now and over the coming days. Walk us through it.
Well, what's been happening this evening, just within an hour of our interview, is that the official in the Vatican who is entrusted with the first moves that follow the death of a pope officiated at a ceremony in the guest house where Pope Francis lived on the first floor in a two-room suite, deliberately chosen to emphasize that he didn't want a rich church. In there, the Camerlengos, he's called, an Irish-American cardinal, presided over the rite of establishing that the Pope was dead. Accompanied by a doctor and other nominated officials. He, in the old days, it was done by thwacking the poor chap on the head 3 times with a silver hammer to make sure that he was dead. This time it's done, these days it's done with a death certificate. And at the end of that ceremony, there is a kind of a timetable that begins. The first move will be tomorrow, when the cardinals who've already reached the Vatican will assemble and will agree on a date for the lying in state, which looks as though it's going to be starting on Wednesday, and will then take over the running of the ordinary business of the church as others arrive in Rome, because that is also a peculiarity of this particular time, in that Pope Francis appointed cardinals from a long way away. There will be one coming in from the capital of Mongolia, another one from Tonga out in the Pacific. So it'll take some time for them to assemble. And then we have the funeral of the Pope, which it has to take place normally between 4 and 6 days after his death. So it's going to be this weekend. After that, we are then waiting for the election of the Pope, which will probably now take place that about sort of between 10 and 15 to 20 days rather after the death.
It's a very, I don't know if secretive is the right word, but it's a very sort of shrouded negotiation that happens to determine who will follow in the footsteps of a deceased pope, and how long that takes with those conversations is anybody's guess. But do you have any insight into the sort of things that are discussed? What sort of back and forth and, you know, toing and froing is going on in those extremely private conversations?
Yes, there is an established method for doing this. 2 eminent clerics are brought in to address the cardinals about the issues that are facing the church. And that's really the procedure. First of all, to look at what is the dominant theme that they need to focus on, and then from there start thinking about which of the cardinals would make the best pope to confront that particular issue. And to give an example, the the idea that was formed before the election of Pope Benedict was that the big issue was the evangelization or re-evangelization of Europe, and therefore they needed a European pope, and they lighted on the German cardinal, as he then was, Ratzinger. So that's what they're going to be discussing above all in these informal discussions, called congregations, that take place before the conclave, which is, as you said, very much a private affair. The word itself means with key, and they are locked into the Sistine Chapel. In the old days, they were locked in there 24 hours a day until they came up with a decision. And now it's a little bit more civilized because they're bussed back to the the Vatican's guest house to spend the night, but very much cut off from the rest of the world, only talking among themselves.
What do you think? I'm fascinated to hear you talking about the contextualization of what is the big sort of thematic, main issue, the kernel of what the Catholic Church is having to face, and who's going to be the best person to deal with that. Already, when we're looking at newspaper reports in the United Kingdom over the runners and the riders, for want of a better phrase, it seems to me the fulcrum around which the debate about who should succeed is sort of hinged is this idea of the fight between a sort of progressive liberal Catholic Church, which is trying to mould itself into the structures that are now sort of represented within society, the progressivism, let's call it, and then those who say, well, actually, perhaps we've reached a tipping point and the Catholic Church shouldn't be having to bend and scrape according to some sort of neo-ideologies imposed from Lord knows where, but should be standing up for the fundamental values of the Christian faith. Do you think that is going to be the dividing issue here when one looks at who should succeed as the next pope, whether essentially he is a Catholic or a sort of change-making pope?
Well, I think that one thing we can say is that the next pope will be a Catholic.
So I meant a conservative, so mostly conservative. As soon as I said it, I realised I'd used the wrong word.
But having said that, I think that the duality that you have just summarised is definitely going to be running right the way through this conclave, because Francis, by his more open approach, has created enemies within the church, has created critics, and there will be that continuing standoff between liberals and conservatives, undoubtedly. But I don't think that that is going to be the kind of theme that they will latch onto. Right. They will be thinking about such issues as whether, for example, the big issue now is the rise of China, and what needs to be done for that, in which case they might opt for an Asian pope. They may be thinking in terms of the division between the rich north, global north, and the poorer global south. And there are other theological issues that they may decide are more important. For example, whether the church in future should be ruled in the way that Francis had initially promised, with much more respect given to the opinions of the bishops and archbishops out in the field. That kind of issue might be what they light upon and then decide this is what we've got to go for, and therefore the man that we need is X or Y. They think about these things in a different way to the way that journalists like ourselves think about them.
No doubt. And it's interesting. I think a lot of the world will probably be looking upon the election, if that's the right word, of the next pope as a sort of marker of where we are at perhaps in the West, in the world as a whole, when it comes to that sort of tug of war between conservatism and progressivism, for want of a better phrase. John Hooper, thank you ever so much, a Vatican correspondent for The Economist. I walked myself into a joke there, didn't I, as the Pope a Catholic? You bet you believe it. John Hooper, ironically, was a bishop back in the day in Gloucester, who Mary I had put to his death because he was not a Catholic, ironically. Little historical factoire for you there, apropos of nothing whatsoever.